Greetings and welcome to the Dr. J Vlog series. It's Friday, May 9th, 2025, and on Fridays we talk about human behavior and justifications. Do you ever wish or imagine a world without conflict or cruelty or human suffering? I know it's basically impossible to imagine outside of our fantasies, our fabrications. Or we defer that possibility until the afterlife, which, after all, exists after this life. And this life always and inevitably involves pain and conflict, but especially between people like us, the good guys, and people like them, the bad guys. The Manichaean reality that's so often invoked to explain and justify the difference between good and evil. And yet at the core of these distinctions, we have to use our brains, of course, to make them, which process information in different cultural and historical context to arrive about certain conclusions to distinguish us from them. That is to say, we all learn about good and evil through the myths, through the stories that are passed down through our generations in our specific languages. We all have them. And then we use these to instill or develop certain memories, real or imagined, to help us make sense out of our worlds and our desires and where we see ourselves and our kind fitting in. So to be fair, then, cultures everywhere have their own creation myths, their own shared memories that distinguish themselves from everyone else. And as you might expect, the proverbial we usually occupies the privileged place in these cultural narratives. That is, having survived the threats, the incursions, and the contamination of the others whom we've encountered along the way. And this broad description has been just as true in the 20th century as in every preceding century in human history. But what distinguishes the 20th century, I think, would be the robustness with which humanities established an international nation-state system. And it's a system of governance that continues to dominate in 2025. So we have nearly 200 formally recognized nations in the world today, as well as, of course, many other territories and other types of jurisdictions. And so these various states, however constructed, have variously been allies and adversaries. Much of the 20th century, then, has been shaped by the major world wars and other conflicts that have pitted different peoples and types of governments against one another. Again, often in the last couple of hundred years, under the auspices of one's national identity on behalf of one's nation. And yesterday, on May 8th, you'll recall, we commemorated the 80th anniversary of VE Day, that is Victory in Europe Day. More specifically, May 8th, 1945 refers to the Allies' acceptance of Germany's unconditional surrender. So my father fought in the Second World War, as did tens of millions of Americans and Canadians and other Allied soldiers. And the war, on the whole, resulted in the deaths of at least 70 to 80 million people worldwide, with at least twice as many civilian deaths as there were military deaths. So incredibly costly. And so I learned, in my upbringing, the story that I learned about World War II was that it resulted ultimately in the defeat of fascism, considered to be one of the ultimate expressions of evil in the modern world. And the irony, in my view, is that the creation of the nation-state system and that penchant for the creation stories and the myths, these have all helped fuel the very existence of that which we so heartily claimed to dislike and ultimately defeated, and that is fascism. And I'd even argue that as long as we have the nation-state system in its current form, there will always be a tendency to shift towards fascism in the absence of robust and long-respected democratic institutions. So the belief that all men are created equal, for example, the notion of a government of the people, by the people, and for the people, and even 20th century proclamations such as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that followed the Second World War. These are all meant to serve as ideological bulwarks against fascism. And yet these bulwarks have continued to be eroded, again, by the very fabric of the nation-state system that's ostensibly meant to thwart authoritarianism and singular military dominance, that sort of thing. So the threat of fascism remains as real and as relevant as ever, in my view. So what is fascism? Well, it's the belief in an authoritarian system of government infused with a political ideology that emphasizes extreme nationalism, usually rooted in ethno-linguistic ties, but also that involves militarism and the supremacy, this fundamental belief in the supremacy in the nation over the individual. So fascist regimes then are often dominated by prototypical strongmen, and they are invariably men whose political party often brooks very little or no opposition. Some use the term the cult of the personality to describe how fascist regimes cultivate images of their leaders as great figures, figures who are to be loved and admired unconditionally, and again, usually perpetuated through the mass media and different forms of propaganda. So this brings me back to my original point then about human beings and our knowledge of the human brain and human behavior. So fascism always invokes a mythic past that has been destroyed somehow. The mythic past usually involved some kind of racial and/or religious purity, where the nation used to be great and was led by patriotic generals and the able-bodied men who served as the loyal warriors. And they were stoked, of course, by this nationalist pride. And at the same time, then, they were supported by their wives who remained at home to raise the next generation. But what happened? The past somehow got destroyed, and the once great country suffered defeat and humiliation, a la Germany following the First World War, classic example. But again, they suffered defeat maybe historically at the hands of certain national enemies, but also perhaps by the intersection or as the byproduct of a range of other different broader forces, say of globalism, of liberal cosmopolitanism, cultural decay or decadence, and or even things like universal expressions of human rights and values such as equality. So fascism in general then doesn't permit criticism or dissent, either of the current government or in terms of acknowledging possible past indiscretions or even atrocities that may have been committed by the nation's leaders. So fascist regimes then repudiate the dark moments of the past to instead remind people of the greatness and the glory of times past. And this is what must be reclaimed. Before everything fell apart under the corrupt leadership of democratic regimes and global forces that would privilege these liberal values like the dignity of every human being or human equality, these sorts of things. And so in most fundamental respects, then, democracy is the antithesis of fascism. And then the cultural memories of the nation have to reflect only the nation's great past. History must then be rewritten, and any evidence to the contrary must be destroyed or labeled in this day and age as fake news, for example. And so what I just want to talk a little bit more about today then, in the second half then of this vlog, are the key features that seem to facilitate the rise and the dominance of fascism, whether you're talking about in the 1930s, or if you fast forward nearly a century later. And so drawing upon the work specifically of Jason Stanley in his brilliant book, How Fascism Works, and I'll leave a link below, I'm going to briefly just describe 5 key elements. There are more, but this is just what I want to talk about today. And so these include the importance of propaganda, anti-intellectualism, unreality, perpetual victimhood, and the weaponization of the legal system. So the importance of propaganda has long been recognized and studied as such, especially in the aftermath of Nazi Germany and Italy under Mussolini. And so if you're going to centralize authority and establish clear enemies who must be eliminated, then you have to be able to control the messaging and the manner in which you can effectively scapegoat any undesirable others. And that requires the use then of specific language that demonizes or dehumanizes these others, who then are cast as being responsible for destroying our country. And perhaps most powerfully of all, as Stanley writes, quote, political propaganda uses the language of virtuous ideals to unite people behind otherwise objectionable ends, end quote. So in other words, how else can you imprison or even deport your opponents or anyone who doesn't look like you or speaks the right language? And for fascists, corruption then always means the corruption of purity rather than the violation of the law or human rights. The second principle involves anti-intellectualism. Again, Stanley writes that fascist politics seeks to undermine public discourse by attacking and devaluing education, expertise, and language. Intelligent debate is often impossible without an education with access to different perspectives, a respect for expertise when one's own knowledge gives out, and a rich enough language to precisely describe reality. And so again, fascist regimes then typically attack all of these potential sources of intellectual truth, wherever and whenever these don't align with their vision and version of reality. Hence, universities and science and the media, for example, are all subject to critique, censorship, and even cancellation, if their truths, that is, and their messages don't align with the dominant regimes. So conveying information then is all about asserting power and authority rather than discovery, dialogue, debate. And then that leads down the pathway towards unreality, the third idea that Stanley mentions. Again, he mentions others, but I'm just emphasizing 5 today. So since we cannot trust universities because of their inherent biases, and we cannot trust science because we doubt the validity of their studies and their expertise, and we cannot trust the fake news, then who can we trust? Right, just the fascist leader, the state machinery that's in the service of authoritarianism. In simplest terms, the fascist leader and their minions are the authorities and the arbiters of reality, not any of these alternative sources of facts and news and information. So the real truth then can only be discerned by ignoring and indeed suppressing all of these alternatives, again, in the service of another type of purification. There exists then a hierarchy of power and authority, wherein you have purveyors of truth from the fascist perspective who are at the top of the hierarchy, and they are reinforcing continually these perpetual messages of victimhood. Sorry, I should have turned off my phone. I usually do that. Okay? And so why are they victims? Well, grievances are essentially the oxygen and the lifeblood of fascist regimes. Those in charge are perpetually aggrieved because they and their kind are always under threat, both by external forces and even forces within their countries.
I didn't understand that.
Well, that's because you weren't paying attention properly. That's the phone. Yeah. So again, where do these sources come from? Who are the individuals who end up being targeted as such? Well, they include all the usual suspects, from ethno-racial minorities to linguistic minorities, immigrants, refugees, religious minorities, and anyone or everyone who somehow wants to make claims for equal rights, or who wants to have economic privileges, or somehow threaten the existing power structure. And most importantly, anybody who threatens the dominant social status of the groups who are in charge. All of these folks then would be considered or defined as a potential threat. So again, they're multifaceted, multifarious in nature, and in effect, there's always someone out there who's threatening the purity of the nation and its people. Nationalism always lies at the heart of fascism, and fascist leaders employ strategies then to amplify people's collective sense of victimhood. Despite often being a numeric or political or even a cultural majority, they are the ones who are under threat, and they are the ones who are being persecuted. So whoever presents a fundamental challenge to their identity, to their mythology, to their use of the narrative must be defined as the enemy and must be dealt with harshly. And then that leads to my final point for today. If you're defined then as my enemy, then under fascist regimes, you are not entitled to due process or equal protections. You and your kind are, almost by definition, criminals or illegal aliens or terrorists or rapists and murderers and so on. You are the worst of the worst, and you must be eliminated. And so if you happen to look like one of us, though, and yet you still do not subscribe to our fascist ideology, then you're also part of the problem, potentially. So fascists then have zero tolerance for such people. That is, they should be defunded. They should be stripped of their institutional authority. They should be sued in courts and or somehow silenced rather than being allowed to spread their poisonous ideas. So in today's language, the problem might be simply that they are too woke, as per the charges already being launched by the far right at the new Pope, Leo XIV. He's being reviled for being a woke Marxist, for example, and much more. So in short, fascism demands an end to things like equality and social justice and democratic principles like freedom of expression. And so in the extreme then, fascism represents the ultimate form of cruelty towards those who do not belong in your country or in your tribe. Anything less than the abject suffering of people that you don't like would be considered too woke. They only care about cruelty. Are the animals, the scumbags, the pieces of fecal matter being defeated, destroyed, or deported, or ideally just dead? And that's the essence of fascism. And that's apparently what a significant number of people want in some form or another. In fact, tens of millions of people in countries all over the world, they may not use the term fascist to describe themselves, but they certainly support much of the ideology that I've just described. And they support the leaders in their countries who have these kinds of fascist authoritarian tendencies. But again, it's built upon the nation-state system itself to a degree, and almost inevitably. So you cannot really have nations without nationalism. And ultranationalism then serves as one of the fundamental bases of fascism. And so that's why we have for generations stressed the importance of liberal democratic institutions and human rights as the foundation of healthy countries and democracies. It's, again, essentially why we fought the Second World War. And I believe that we are once again on the brink of fascism dominating in many countries around the world. And herein lies the ultimate paradox. Fascists would want people like myself to be dead, to be eliminated. But I don't feel the same about them as human beings. I do not wish pain or cruelty or even death, certainly not death, upon those with whom I most vociferously disagree. That just doesn't align with my own life's mission or moral framework. So how do I reconcile all of this? Well, that's a very complicated story for another day. So in the meantime, may you and yours continue to create peace in your lives, nurture love in your hearts, and dole out hugs in abundance, no matter to whom and wherever you may find them along the political spectrum, although that might sound a little bit too woke for some of you. In any event, hope to see you soon. Take care.